Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. This afternoon's panel is focused on life after Moody. It's a conversation with LGBTQ alums and our allies. My name is Dr. Ciszek. I'm faculty in the School of Advertising and Public Relations here at the Moody College of Communication. And I'm going to introduce today's panelists and introduce what we're talking about. LGBTQ students are essential members of our family here at Moody and have been integral in shaping the present efforts and future ambitions of our college. We're inviting three accomplished Moody alum whose professional work has really centered queer communities in diverse and compelling ways. They will discuss their career paths, how questions of personal identity influence their work, and offer some guidance to Moody students that are embarking on their own professional endeavors. Let me start out by introducing Jett Garrison. Jett is a transgender WGA writer and director, currently staffed as a writer on the CW Network's reboot of the 4400. Jett's known for directing the award-winning digital series These Thems, winning the Best Director Award from Chicago's Pride Film Festival. He's won an Emmy and has been nominated for an Oscar for his short film work. Welcome, Jett. Yes, let's turn video on, please. Cool. Hi, Jett. Welcome. The second panelist I'd like to introduce is Danielle Villasana. Danielle is a photojournalist based in Istanbul whose documentary work focuses on human rights, gender, displacement, and health around the world. She's a National Geographic Explorer, a Women Photograph Grantee, a Magnum Foundation awardee, and an International Women's Media Foundation Fellow. Danielle strongly believes in pairing photography with education and community. She's co-founder of We Women, and also an Authority Collective board member on the Everyday Project community team, and a Photo Bill of Rights co-author. Welcome, Danielle. And our third panelist is Dr. Billy Table. Dr. Billy Table is a UX research consultant at Answer Lab, faculty at Widener University Center for Human Sexuality Studies, and a Moody CMS alum. Billy earned their PhD in Communication Studies with a focus on interpersonal health communication in spring 2020, and completed a postdoc duly appointed to the UT Austin Center for Health Communication in the Dell Medical School in the Department of Population Health. As a researcher and educator, Billy has been dedicated to exploring difficult conversations, issues of accessibility, and the development of tools for more effective communication. Welcome to all the panelists, and thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful to have everyone here. I'd like to start out with my first question, and that centers UT's slogan, which some of you may be familiar with. It's what starts here changes the world. And I'd really like for you to reflect on how you are embodying that and how you're manifesting that change through your own work and initiatives. So maybe we can start out with Jett, then Danielle, and Billy in that order. That would be wonderful if you could take a few minutes to respond. Thanks.
Wait, so the question was, how am I changing the world?
Oh, how are you embodying the slogan, what starts here changes the world?
Gotcha.
In your own work. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and thank y'all for inviting me. And I apologize in advance for any noise in the background. I'm actually on a production right now, but I guess the answer to that question for me is always in any of my work, it's really about, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't see folks like me in the camera, you know, queer or trans, and visibility and representation does matter. And so for me, in any work that I create myself, it's always trying to look at what is work that I haven't seen out there, and also how can I enhance stories of folks who, you know, for lack of a better word, have been marginalized throughout media, characters or storylines, because still to this day, we keep seeing so much of the same story. It's starting to shift. There is a shift happening in Hollywood, which we can all talk about to some degree. But for me personally, what is going to draw me to story or characters, it's really who are those stories and characters and narratives that have been traditionally unrepresented. And that is kind of at the core of what I look for, and also chosen family. Specifically for us queerdos, is how do we look at chosen family, and what are those stories like?
Thanks, Jett. Danielle.
Yeah, just echoing Jett, it's really awesome to be here with you all and hear what amazing things you all have to say, and also like changing the world, maybe not. That made me laugh, Jett. But yeah, thank you again for the invitation. And if only we were all in person, but maybe next time. Anyways, so yeah, I mean, when I was a student at UT, you hear that a lot, right? What starts here changes the world, and you're kind of like, nah, this sounds like such a big thing to do to change the world. But I think for me, as both a photojournalist and someone who has worked really hard within the visual media industry to increase inclusivity, I try to hold on to the belief that even small changes are valuable, and not to get so overwhelmed with like everything has to change tomorrow, and how to like, keep building on that change and keep building on, the efforts that people have made for decades and decades and decades and decades. So yeah, again, as a photojournalist, I try to, having focused on communities of trans women throughout Latin America for a decade, that was actually a project that I started at UT that stemmed from looking at LGBTQIA families in Texas, because as a native Texan, being so frustrated with the legislation then, and now, look at now, trying to tell positive stories of LGBTQIA families as a way to sort of counter the lack of that in the media. And then when that is present in the media, oftentimes it's more harmful stereotypes. So that led to where I am today, a decade later. So, and again, I started that as a student. So yeah, just trying to take those values and the work that I create, and then also who I am as a photojournalist and other initiatives to increase inclusivity, which I'm sure I can touch on at some point, but I'd love to hear what Billy has to say.
Thank you, Danielle, for that handoff. Oh my gosh, I just love everything that has been said thus far. It really resonates with me about representation. Like, you can't be what you can't see, and also being patient with progress, because it takes time. And for me, when I think about what starts here changes the world, I think about all the practice that I got being an advocate, being in student groups, or being a researcher and advocating for the voices and bringing the voices of LGBTQ plus folks into the forefront, into social science, because I remember being baby grad student being like, well, where's the gays though? And where's the trans people though? And so I'm really all about being an advocate, and I got the practice using my voice at UT, and then now I'm out in the world, and what I'm trying to do is pay it forward. I teach at Widener University in the Center for Sexuality Studies, and I teach their grad students who are future sex educators and future sex therapists. I teach them about communication and gender and theory and things like that. And then in my current role as a consultant, I am often the person who will say, okay, but who isn't at the table? Because I have a lot of privilege. I'm queer, I'm trans, but I also have a lot of privilege. And so I try to use, the power that I have, and also just being like an extrovert and not being afraid to like talk and like bring things up. I try to, speak up for those who aren't, either voices aren't at the table or just aren't being heard. So that's one way, a couple ways, several ways. So back to you.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Much appreciated. Kind of building on the local sort of climate in terms of your experiences at UT. I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe some lessons that you learned while you were at the university, at the college specifically, either good or bad, however, takeaways that you had from your time, here, and how you might think about those and use them in your day-to-day lives, both in your professional careers and maybe in your personal lives as well, whichever direction you want to take it. Does anyone want to take that question first?
I mean, I could tell you the first thing I thought about.
Sure.
And this isn't necessarily, I mean, I could make it gay in some type of way, but it's not necessarily gay. So what I'm thinking about, and I just talked about this with my students, is about how important it is, if you want your work to resonate with all different kinds of people, it's to consider your audience and to be able to translate your message to, and I don't mean necessarily translate languages, but to be aware of the type of words you use, whether it's jargon or it's field specific. If you want your message or your product or your research to be useful to people, you have to be able to kind of put it into lay terms and, talk about it conversationally. And so I just think that that's not only a tool for, it has a lot of practicality and it might seem obvious, but it's harder than you would think. And it takes a lot of practice. And it speaks to, it's not just, this should be accessible to make it easy. It's also like how to, make yourself aware of like systems of privilege for people who just like can't, who don't speak your same language, don't have the same level of education, don't know about what you're talking about. So that was one of the things that's like huge for me that I use all the time, and that I think, that stuck out to me.
Awesome. Danielle, and then Jett. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, Billy, you mentioned language and words, because one thing that I learned as a student, and it's not necessarily directly related to LGBTQ plus, but I, like Billy said, I can make it gay. But no, a class that I took that was like so just sort of eye-opening was race and ethnicity in the media. And, it really just taught me so much about the power that the media has in terms of shaping how we view the world, how we view ourselves, going back to what Jett said about, where are the stories about, LGBTQ plus folks, where LGBTQ plus folks, sitting at the table. So, as practitioners of the media, we have a lot of power. So words are really powerful, and what we put out into the world is extremely powerful. And so taking that as, a gift that, is to be treated with caution and carefully and ethically, and consistently, continuously asking yourself, am I being ethical? Am I being, what is my message? And sort of always revisiting that, I think is really important. And for example, I mentioned, I'm a photographer, right? I go out, I take pictures, but I'm also work with a lot of grassroots photo organizations that are working to increase inclusivity in the visual media industry. And so that goes to what, Billy was saying about privilege, right? So like, if you do find yourself at the table, who can you make room for at the table? Who can you push off the table to make some space for others? And that brings me to the Photo Bill of Rights. I'm a co-author of this like extremely extensive document and toolkits, but we have a whole glossary of words, that we can sort of be more mindful of, and realizing that we have power in language, and that we have power you know, in the media. So yeah, that again, that class that I took at UT, you know, that was probably just, I thought you know, I'll take this class. It really changed a lot in how I view the media and myself as a member of the media.
Wow, y'all both kind of really helped, you know, pitch it over to me with that, because it's this notion of language, 100%, and language 100%, and then also imagery, right? So I think that's what Danielle is talking about is, you know, I joke with my friends, I have, you know, 3 expensive pieces of paper from the University of Texas and the student loan debt to prove it. But, you know, with my master's in theory and thinking about, you know, who has the right to tell certain folks' stories, right? And where is the privilege there? And I think you were just talking about that, you know, that intersectionality. And so early on, I had that advantage because, you know, I got my master's in media studies, not knowing that I wanted to be a filmmaker. So kind of got that foundation in studying in gender and sexuality and really kind of getting a grasp on that. And then I realized maybe theory wasn't for me and I wanted to practice. And I started with documentary. So Danielle, I think we have some things in common there. And so then, you know, when I got my MFA and really thinking about the frame, right? And what is perspective and what is gaze, you know, and it can be so stripped down, you know, at the time to, you know, what is the male, what is the female gaze, what is the heteronormative gaze, what is the hegemonic gaze, what is a queer gaze, what does any of that mean? You know, you look at the 90s and new queer cinema and some of the films that were being made then, and I was lucky to be able to witness that moment, and it's not necessarily like that. So being able to study those films there at UT and study, you know, the language around it, Billy, what you were talking about, then also perspective and privilege, and yes, race and heritage, but also class, right? We don't talk a lot about class and how that comes into play, you know, with that as well. And then what does that mean for us queerdos? You know, when I use that term in an endearing, loving way, and for trans folk, you know, you watch a film like Disclosure, which really examines the levels of how, you know, the agency of who were the storytellers of those narratives. And it wasn't trans folks and it wasn't queer folk. And so having that foundation that I had coming from the university and having, you know, that balance of theory and practice, it really shaped how I have conversations now with some of the industry executives who maybe don't have that foundation. And so without necessarily taking them to school, we can have conversations and say, okay, well, how does this present itself? And not only are the story we're telling, but what is the perspective and what is the gaze that we're bringing? So I think having that foundation at UT really helped me personally.
I really appreciate that, Jett, which makes me sort of think more about one of the topics you posed in the email thread that we had before this panel, which is thinking about access and gatekeeping. And I'm hoping you could expand upon, you know, that in terms of the ways in which you see that gatekeeping. You know, often we talk about sort of things on the representational level in the classroom, right? We're looking at queer representation in film, queer representation in advertising. And one thing in my class I like to sort of emphasize is like, let's talk about production, right? And so maybe you could talk a little bit, you know, starting with Jett, but also, you know, Danielle and Billy as well. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about like queer production in gatekeeping in that regard, and maybe start by conceptualizing what you mean by gatekeeping so we're all on the same page. And Jett, if you don't mind kicking us off with that.
Sure. I mean, this I don't want to take up the conversation because this is, as y'all know, I mean, I think Billy and Danielle know this, like, it's like who is, even which is grant writing, right? Who is making the decisions? Who is giving access to who can make something? But it's been interesting, and you know, in Hollywood, we're at a shift right now. And I think that there are so many amazing and talented queer and trans creatives who have so many unique voices, right? And I think that in the past, traditional Hollywood executives who's like, oh, we should put, you know, a queer person in this, or a gay person in this, or a trans person in this. It's more for the nod, right? They want to check a D&I box, right? Versus thinking, what kind of story am I trying to tell? And they have no grasp. They think every character is a monolith experience. And so there are so many trans and queer creatives who are coming and pitching to these executives. And these executives are hearing these stories and they all sound alike to them. And what I've gotten in a room when I go and pitch to an executive, these are the gatekeepers, the people that say, here's your pitch. We want to make your show yes or no. And if they have a show that is already in the space, right, which could be, you know, FX networks maybe had Pose. So I come in and say, here's my show about this trans-masculine character. And they could say, and this is an example, y'all. And they could say, oh, we already have a show in the space because they have a show called Pose. And my show is nothing like that, but in their mind, it's the same and the audience is the same. So until we get, oh, Kitty making an appearance, this is my favorite part of Zoom. But until we get executives like us and the broad array of intersectionality, we're not going to have folks that understand the nuances, that aren't going to have the conversations with the SVPs and the presidents of the studios and the networks to say, no, this isn't the same. And we had that in the past with you know, stories about women, with stories about people of color. Like this has always been this thing, oh, we have something in the space. It's starting to change. And now we have somebody like Elliot Page, who has his own pod, right? A production company, who is now being barraged by all of us because we're so excited. There's a champion for our stories, and there's starting to be more and more of that. But that's basically what I mean about the gatekeepers, who is sitting in their executive office deciding who has the right to get their stories out there. And I think that until there are more of us in those positions, because we are in abundance, queer creators, talented storytellers are in abundance. We are here, we're ready, and we just need those people that are ready to champion and elevate us. And that can come in the form of allies that actually use the word ally as a verb, right? Not just a little adjective stamp. I think I'm using that right, but that's sort of a snapshot if that helps kind of with what I was talking about.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Billy, would you like to sort of comment on that?
Sure.
Question? Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Love Elliot Page. No, okay, I do. And so I think what I wanted to, something that I was thinking about was how, you know, of course, these big production companies, they have the money, the power, they have the ways in which they can like push content out to folks, you know, and produce seasons and seasons of shows. And I was just thinking about how more and more the power of like social media and platforms in which creators kind of are the ones who are putting out their own content. You know, of course, these aren't necessarily like full movies, but like putting out YouTube series and like TikTok content that leads into businesses and things like that. I'm just thinking about ways in which queer folks are trying to uplift their voices in ways that they can, and how they've kind of tried to subvert those you know, immovable gatekeeping kind of blockades. And so I was just, I mean, I would kind of maybe even bounce it back to Jett and Danielle being sort of the media experts here. But like, what is the role of creator-led platforms in sort of this bigger picture for queer folks?
Yeah, I'm so inspired by both of you. I'm like furiously writing notes and wish we had just, you know, another full hour and a half to keep talking about this. But okay, where to begin? Trying to read my own handwriting here. But yeah, I think, you know, one thing that came to mind just as you were talking, Billy, is like, if it doesn't exist, make it exist. So I'll get back to that. And then what you were saying, Jett, about, you know, Hollywood and people, you know, the people in power who are like, oh no, we have that story. I mean, this happens too in photojournalism all the time. You know, it's like, you try to pitch a story, you know, about, I don't know, let's say, you know, for example, LGBT Q plus families, and they'll say, oh, well, we ran a story about that 3 years ago or whatever, you know. It's like, well, but there can be many stories on this because it's, you know, nuanced and layered. And so that's also a constant fight within, you know, photojournalism, because of the sort of like, you know, stereotypes that exist, and people just, like you said, you know, viewing this community as a monolith. So yes, to creating more space for nuance, and changing the storytellers and making space for storytellers. And then back to the thing about, you know, if it doesn't exist, make it into existence. I mean, definitely, you know, in my work, you know, photographing communities of trans women. I mean, I've had, you know, editors, other photographers, like, who are really, you know, renowned, say like, well, why are you photographing daily life? Like, people don't want to see this. People want to see, like, you know, this. And it's like, at some point, you know, these are your, like, you know, your bosses, your, you know, people you look up to telling you this, and it feels, you know, you feel conflicted because you're like, well, that's not what I'm trying to do. That's not what I want to say. I want to say something different that I don't see in the media, and what I do see in the media is harmful, and I don't want to do that. And you have to listen to yourself, right? Like, so as students and going out into the world, like, you may be swimming up, it may feel like you're swimming upstream, you know, but if you feel it in your heart and you know, just stay true to your vision, I think is really important. And then, yeah, if it doesn't exist, make it exist. So there's a lot of, you know, grassroots photo organizations like the Authority Collective, Women Photograph, the Everyday Projects, all of these like organizations that have popped up over the past few years, even, you know, long after I started, and, you know, they're just making it happen. They say, oh, you don't know any edit, you know, Mr. Miss Editor, whatever, you don't know any like women or gender nonconforming photographers. Well, here's a database of 1,000 of them. So now you have no more excuses, because here they are. So, you know, making those things into existence, if it doesn't already exist, you know, you have that power, you can make it happen. You don't need somebody up here to tell you, okay, you can go do this thing now, you know, you can do it, make it happen. I think we'll try.
You know
Yeah,
what,
yeah.
Danielle, something you were just saying made me also think that one thing that is advantageous for being, you know, an independent creator, so what Billy was talking about before, is the audience is so hungry for our stories and our content that even if it's on the independent level, they will seek it out. And I think that I would tell young creatives and young filmmakers that it is daunting, right? Because then you have to get the marketing, you have to draw eyes to it, but people are hungry for the content that we are creating. And I sometimes have to remind myself of that as hope, you know, and putting out content that it may not be immediate, but the audience will grow because we want. It's been such a dearth that the audience wants it.
May I also jump in? I love that point, because it's like, oh yeah, we are so hungry for please give us anything. Danielle's point also kind of made me think about, so you're talking about like there being networks and ways that we can refer each other to different jobs, to different opportunities. When somebody's asking for this particular kind of photographer or whatnot, and it made me think about the importance of mentor relationships and peer, you know, just like peers helping out peers. Like we have this like underground queer network where we're just like helping each other. And I had this flashback of like, oh yeah, of course, like I had so many queer elders in academia, and then even in my workplace now, I'm like, oh, I'm finding them, you know, we're all finding each other like this. And you know, I'm just thinking about how, you know, I was helped out and given opportunities, and then I pay that forward and try and help others. And so I'm just thinking about if there's, you know, grad students on the call, help an undergrad, and then like for people who are in position, you know, faculty positions or other like positions where you have lots of opportunities to pass on, like, you know, put the names of people in those rooms, you know, say if that person's not in that room, say their name, and like just give each other opportunities. So I thought that's something that I try to do too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that resonates with me as well as an educator and an instructor, you know, trying to build those networks of connection. And like Jett, you were saying, right, those chosen families, often that happens, you know, I know for myself and my own sort of like coming of age, right, those chosen families very much started coming together when I was an undergraduate student, you know, and we continue to assemble those. So yeah, Jett.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I love that you brought up the mentorship of it all, because you know, when I got out to LA, you know, I started mentoring with the Outfest film, the Queer Film Festival here in LA, with their Outset Young Filmmaking program. And one of the beautiful things about doing something like that is you also get mentored up, and you also learn and grow, you know, in your own right. And you know, for me and my coming to my truth, being transgender, if it was not for that experience and seeing the bravery and just the acceptance that they have at such a young age now, because that wasn't how it was when we were growing up, when I was in my 20s, you know. And so there, it wasn't just about the filmmaking, it was also just about that relationship, you know, the mentee mentor, the young queers and gays, and the more mature queers and gays, you know. And I really love that opportunity.
Great. Anyone else want to add on to that? Mentoring, networking, what does that look like? It also makes me think about how within sort of queer identities, how one comes of age, like at a different juncture in their lives, right? And you know, how it's not sort of like the linear puberty sort of coming of age in the traditional sense, right? Like where we sort of discover our identities, and our identities sort of unfold through you know, a variety of sort of like ages in our lives, right? So it's a very non-linear process, and how sometimes that happens at different ages and phases of our lives as well, right? Kind of to try to complicate some of that linear model of growth and growing up.
Danielle, were you about to say something? Go for it.
No, I have nothing to say, but I'm just like, we don't want to talk about our childhood. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, no, please, Billy, please.
Oh, it's just earlier Jett was like, hey, you want to talk nerdy, talk some theory and stuff? And it just reminds me about, I think it's Judith Butler who came up with queer timelines, how you know, as queers, we do things on a different timeline than the normative heteronormative timeline. Is like, okay, you find a partner and you get married and have a kid, and here's what you do, and you're settled in your career. And it's like, okay, well, so plenty of queers do that, get married and have kids, but also for years we couldn't, and so we created different milestones, we created different things that had meaning to us and come into our identity over time, and different markers for like what was important to us, and also historically there's so many people who you know, who died, and who saw the timelines of their loved ones and chosen family, saw the timelines compacted or cut short. And so I just think about that, yeah, I don't know. So queer timelines and temporality.
Also, something you're just talking about, Billy, and this reminds me also about, you know, the importance, you know, of all of our work, is who is telling our histories, right? And that's something that's current, you know, and that goes back to that mentorship thing of realizing that not everybody knows the same timelines that some of us know, and each one of us is staggered, and so much of it, especially before social media and the interweb, was so regional, right? And how things would come from New York to San Francisco, come down. I grew up in the 90s as a queerdo in Texas, and what that was like, in that concept of small town gay bar, where everybody went to the same bar because you kind of had to, and you were just, you were just there for the fight. And it's very interesting in thinking about creating media and even analyzing what has come and specific time period of what was going on in the more hegemonic, more mainstream environment, and how important that is. So I don't know, that just reminded me of that. And I sometimes take that for granted now.
Yeah, that makes me think about archives, how important archives are. There's an amazing Instagram account. I think it's Archivo Trans, and it's it's like old pictures from the 80s and 70s, 90s of pictures of trans women by trans women in Latin America. And it's just the most amazing, piece of history ever. And it's like, yeah, so it's like and there's a Black women photographer who I admire so much, Bethany Mollenkoffen. She talks a lot about, a lot of her work is she thinks about the archive, right? Like her work now is going to go into this archive about identity. And so, it's not just for now that we're making this work, but it's for the future, and to continue paving those ways, for future generations. So yeah, the archive is, so valuable as well. Y'all should follow that Instagram account if you don't. It's like,
yeah, can you drop it into the chat, because I didn't quite catch what it was.
Yeah, I'll find it. I just want to make sure
I'd love for each of you to think about, or for maybe us to think about a little bit more about that idea of like an archive of representations. Like, I think a lot of what we do on various levels, right, whether it's, in the film production space or the photojournalism space, or in the research, is like archiving and like taking inventory of a moment in time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts or reflections on, the present moment, what the contemporary landscape with, various anti-trans bills in the state and on a national level, sort of queer identities on a global scale, the creative and promotional industries. I'm in the School of Advertising and Public Relations, and often we're talking about sort of rainbow washing and pandering to queer consumers in a sort of landscape of neoliberalism, and how that feels real crappy. So I don't know, tell me your thoughts on some of those topics off script. I'm curious.
That sounds like a Billy softball.
No way. You too, everyone.
Hey, whoa. I mean, well, I will say, to begin, to any archive, any collection of data, artifacts, what have you, has a perspective, because it has a bias because of the person or people who put it together. And so I know for me, as a white queer millennial, with a high education, like the things that are, that I, even if I'm like, oh, I'm trying to perspective take and think about what is like the most expansive kind of collection that I could put together, I still have a bias in my viewpoint. I will say, I think a group of people could put together something that captures this moment, or captures this point in time. I think you'd have to be intentional about it, and but I just know I'm just going to bring up, first of all, bias. So I wouldn't ever want to do such a important task alone. And you know, there'd have to be ways to kind of validate, or if not validate, but like kind of, you know, in research we do like a member check, you know, it's like, does this collection resonate for not just people who are like me and look like me? So that's the first thing I thought of.
Cool. Jett, what about in the film space? You brought up disclosure. You brought up the immense amount of queer and trans talent that you see in Hollywood on like a large scale as well, like large scale as well as like smaller scale. So what do you think is happening in Hollywood in your experience in film production?
Well, it's interesting, as Philly was talking about, you know, bias and you know, archives. I think we're in this interesting time, you know, with social media as well. I just mean that like not a specific portal, but because there's so much more access and ability to connect with one another, I see multiple archives happening at the same time with sometimes the same objectives, but coming from a little bit different perspectives. So I feel like because we've got this, you know, variety of opportunity, it's also happening within production. I think, Danielle, you were talking earlier about looking for a photojournalist who's trans or queer or whatever. We have a similar thing. We're like, oh, we want to employ more trans people. And I'm on like 4 or 5 different lists of trans creatives. So it's like, who's going to what list? So I you know, I don't know that that's the absolute answer, because I feel like we're still going to keep getting more segmented, which is kind of awesome in one way, because that means there's more of us trying to do the work. But then sometimes I worry if it gets watered down. You know, looking for somebody or you're looking for a partner, what is your portal to go to for that? So I don't know that I have the answer. You know, and I know that there's the UCLA Archives, which is doing a lot of great stuff with like archiving, you know, queer films, and it's very well respected, and restoring old stuff, you know, from the queer cinema before, you know, the 70s and 80s, and finding some gems. But who is, to Billy's point, like who is quote unquote in charge of that, or what is that, you know, group of folks, and what does that collective look like? Yeah, because there is a lot of content out there and being generated. It's more on the independent level that I think we get lost. And I think it's the film festivals that are doing their best. You know, in the past 2 years, we saw like some of the major film festivals like New Fest in New York, Outfest in LA, San Francisco, Frameline in Toronto. And they kind of created a cohort of the film festivals to try to start preserving that. And I think the more that happens versus them cannibalizing each other, I think that's maybe a way, just speaking from the film avenue. I don't know that Hollywood necessarily cares just yet. I'm just being real. But I think at some point, you know, until they can curate it, make some money off of it, they will to some degree. I just went off on a tangent there. It happens.
Danielle, I'd love to hear your perspective. Yeah.
I mean, to kind of derail this and not answer the question, but you know, Billy brought up bias, which is, you know, just of course, you know, the whole when I was a student, you know, it's, oh, you're a journalist, you're supposed to be unbiased, you know, you can't have a bias, you're supposed to be like a robot and just, you know, report the news. But then it's like, well, wait a second, like for the past, you know, have forever, you know, the storyteller has been, you know, white cisgender male, you know, so which is definitely a bias, and you know, has contributed to like how we see the world and how we see ourselves. And so you know, I think we need to acknowledge, even as like journalists who are supposed to tell the truth, like what truth, whose truth, you know, and again, you know, to sort of fight against that implicit bias, you simply just have to change, you know, who is behind the lens, who's telling these stories, but being careful, you know, like Jett said, you know, not to water things down, because then there's also a tendency, you know, for us to just continuously reproduce the same narratives, no matter who is behind the lens, because that's what, you know, is mainstream. So again, kind of having that courage to, you know, to stay true to your vision, even if it goes against, you know, what the mainstream says is, you know, acceptable or whatever. So yeah, sorry to not really answer the archive question, but yeah, I think, you know, Billy makes a great, you know, point about that too, is, you know, even, you know, with that, like there has to be inclusivity, or we're just going to keep doing the same thing, you know, over and over and over again. Like things just have to change. So but I feel confident. I mean, you know, somebody said something, I think we've all said change is slow, but you know, I kind of consider the first time I got paid for an assignment as when I started, and that was in 2014, like after I graduated UT. And there has been considerable, noticeable, big changes since I first started. You know, again, within the photojournalism industry, with people sort of coming together and saying, okay, enough is enough. Like, no more excuses. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, we're gonna create this database, or we're going to create this, you know, photo bill of rights with these toolkits. And I mean, it's like a constitutional document, you know, that talks about like bias and race and ethnicity and abuse and misconduct, and says like, you don't have any excuses anymore, because we are telling you this is a problem, this is why it's a problem, and here's some steps you can take, actionable steps that you can, you know, take into your daily life to kind of make these changes. So yeah, anyways, now I went off on a tangent too, but
Tangents are productive. I appreciate them. There is a question in the chat from one of our attendees. Ming Ching notes or asks, can you guys talk about tokenism in media representation in the media industry, and maybe how you've seen that play out in your respective spaces?
Well, I mean, I think we know it happens and it's there. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about this. You know, there can be one in the space, or let's make a show, oh, we should drop somebody in there to represent, to show that we're being diverse. And I don't know if that's, because that word tokenism in media represent, I mean, that we could go all over the place and what that actually means. But then it becomes like, who is that one character, right? There's this thing of, okay, if you have a writer's room, you know, when I was invited to the writer's room for 4400, it wasn't a queer or trans show, but we had one trans mask character in it. And I was invited to the room to be a writer. And in my head, I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm going to check off the trans mask box. When I got into the writer's room, I was one of 3 trans writers. And that was such a pleasant surprise, because I wasn't kind of quote unquote, you know, that token hire for that story. And that word can be so loaded. Let's just, you know, realize that too. But I think it works behind the camera. And I'm just talking about, you know, film and TV, and in front of the camera. So, you know, if there is a character in the show or movie and they don't have that person in there, they get, you know, they get called out for it. But then if you do have that person in there, then you only have one. So I think it's this weird balance, right? And there is, I can't remember if it's Shonda or somebody who is like, no, we're getting rid of the one rule. You need to at least have 2 in a room if you're trying to represent a non-represented community or character or person, because most of the time, most of the rooms look like me unless you knew I was trans, right? You know, this cis white heteronormative room. So I think it works in front of and behind the camera. I think it's slowly changing, but it has been a bad practice for many, many years. And I don't know what your experience is like that with the photojournalism of it all, Danielle, but I definitely think they're trying to make the change. But again, glacier.
yeah, it needs to be, you know, like authentic, you know, genuine change, because we, you know, not change for change's sake. And it definitely happens within photojournalism. It's like, oh, Black Lives Matter protest, let's hire a Black photographer. Or, you know, somebody needs to, you know, there needs to be a portrait of a trans woman, let's hire a queer photographer. Or, oh, it's a women's issue, so let's hire, it's like, like maybe E for effort, but not quite, you know, like, no, it doesn't just mean we need to hire people to cover these topics. Of course, yes, part of it, but you know, hiring just more people and more inclusivity to do all of the stories, you know. And I love what you know, Billy, you wrote there in the chat. It's like, yeah, come on, you know, it can be exhausting too, right? Because I mean, on the, you know, again, I'm not necessarily in a position you know, to think of it like this word as like being tokenized, but you know, it can be exhausting for people who, you know, because then they're just the expert, you know, for everything. And it's like, you know, and then that labor falls on them. And yeah, so it definitely needs to be like genuine, authentic, like thoughtful change, not just like, oh, let's just, like you said, Jett, like check this box, we're good, we're not going to be canceled because like we've got, you know, that one person, you know. It's like that's not the point, you know. So yeah, how do we, but I think that comes back down to hiring people who are the gatekeepers, you know. Those people have to also be in those really like higher up positions of power, because otherwise people will just be tokenized. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm hoping you could speak a little bit about allyship and what that looks like. Yeah, Jett, actually, let's just emphasize what Jett noted in the chat, that as queer communicators, we also tell non-queer and trans stories as well, right? It's not the only story we tell, not the only stories we tell. Like, we have other skills in our wheelhouse. We're not just professional queer people, you know. So I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that, but sometimes you see a critique about that, both internally within queer communities and externally as well, right?
I do want that shirt that says professional queer. Like, that would be, I will accept that. That's fine.
I would as well. If any of my students would like to gift me one at the end of the semester, I will gladly take it and wear it and share one with Jett too, and all the panelists. Yeah, so let's talk in the time that remains. Let's talk about what good allyship, what allying with a verb, as a verb looks like. What, as people in your respective spaces, does this kind of change work look like? What are some calls to action that you'd like to leave our fellow allies with today?
I can kick this off as the ally in the room. I think education is so important. Like, you don't know, you don't understand, like, educate yourself. Like, it is not up to your, you know, LGBTQ plus or Black or POC friend to tell you about these issues that are problematic, right? So if you don't understand something, seek out the literature and educate yourself. You know, do not put that labor on, you know, these communities. So yeah, educate yourself, because, you know, it is a continuous evolution. There's never like an end point, like, oh, okay, now I'm good, I get it. You know, it's like, no, you have to continuously educate yourself, and it does have to be a verb, right? You know, it is a continuous action, and it's not, and again, it has to be like authentic and genuine, and not just like so that you can feel good about yourself or something. You know, it's like, no, our world really needs like this change, because it's, you know, this is how we view ourselves and view the world. And if we want these changes to be made, then like there needs to be inclusivity. And, you know, if you're sitting at the table, then you have to learn about like how to give your seat up and why that's important, you know. And again, not putting that labor on folks who, you know, are not yet sitting at the table, you know. So yeah, I mean, to me, that's, you know, allyship is, am I learning? Am I listening? Ooh, listening. Like, you know, are you listening? Are you learning? Yeah, actively.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So what I sort of took away from that was active listening and active learning.
I just something you said, Danielle, made me also think like, you're not a tourist in our lives, right? It's not just a stopover, like empowering us, when I mean us, you know, queer, trans folks, non-binary folks, it benefits everybody, right? It's a part of that, and the intersectionality of all of our identities. That once we start to really think about that, no ally is coming to do any of us queer folks a favor, right? And I think about this when I'm looking to tell stories or tell my own stories and I'm pitching to executives. I'm here to do you a favor. I'm here to bring some really compelling characters and stories to you. So it goes back to that listening, right? It's like, this is a communication. This is a partnership. And we can hopefully tell better stories together and convey better characters together. So if you think of it as a win-win in that dialogue, that's how I like to look at it. And that's how I'm trying to pitch now to the allies who are starting to champion our stories, because they start to see that. And there are more and more, especially in Hollywood, more and more A-level stars who have young queer and trans kids who are starting to realize, oh, this is a hope. Not only, it's not this is other, this is a hope for my children. And that's helping. So I think that's something that I've started to tune into as I'm starting to pitch to executives in this town.
Cool, thanks. Billy, thoughts?
Yeah, like I don't want to end it on a cynical note, but no, well, because the thing that Jett brought up, it was like, okay, I'm like my stories, my characters are good, and your kids and the next generations, they're more and more, they're comfortable at an earlier age being, you know, being out, and they want like the queer media, and they want the queer and the trans characters. And it's like the cynical thing that I'm coming at is like, this is gonna make y'all money if you get us to write these, make these stories, like popularize these characters, and like, you know, this is what we want to see. We're hungry for it. I mean, look at RuPaul's Drag Race. Like, it's all we had for a while, and it just blew up. And so anyway, that was my cynical take, that offshoot of what Jett said.
Thank you all so much for joining us. This conversation has been amazing. You all have ended what I consider to be the best 2 days of symposia that I have experienced in a long while. So thank you all so much for being here. It was awesome. And yeah, we'll go ahead and start wrapping things up. But again, thank not only our panelists, but thanks to everyone who attended our second annual Diversity in Media Symposium. As I just said, I mean, I don't know about you all, but this past few days have been inspiring for me, educational, motivating, and the stories that I've heard have really challenged my thinking and have pushed me to want to go further in my understanding of the LGBTQ+ community, and have really strengthened my desire to continue standing in allyship, something we just talked about for a long while, which is great, with those in the community. You know, we at Moody have spent the last few years expanding these conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And in my opinion, none of these can exist without the other. And I think all of the panelists that we've heard from this past few days are not only sort of shifting the paradigm when it comes to who has the right to lead the world, right? But they are opening doors for so many others who have not had the chance to exist in fields that have been exclusionary of those that exist outside of what has traditionally been seen as the norm, right? And I use the word norm because I think we're living in a time where the world is really rethinking who has the right to exist at the center, right? Who has the right to be a decision maker, who has the right to play sports, make films, right? Who has a right to have a seat on the highest court in the land, right? And I think all of these ideas are being rewritten And the folks that you heard from today, including those that are still sitting here right now, they are at the forefront of rewriting that narrative. And I hope that after this past few days, that everyone that's been in attendance, that we really all find ways to be better allies, to be better friends, better cheerleaders, better lovers of the folks that exist around us, and really be bolder in our stance against any injustice that we see happening around us, because that's how we all together collectively begin to shift and change the world. And, you know, I think today and really the past few days, I've heard stories of joy, right? Of community engagement, of existing at the intersections and being out and proud and unapologetic in one's being. And to that, Yaki says yes and amen, right? To that I say, as we've heard today, and to that I say, so be it, right? And again, just thanks to everyone that made today and yesterday happen, every panelist, every moderator, Dean J. Bernhardt, the marketing communications team of Moody, Moody's DEI committee, and this year's Symposium Advisory Council. I also want to thank the Moody Media Scholars for Social Change, who created this year's symposium trailer that you've been seeing over and over again on purpose, right? And none of this could have happened without the help of all of these individuals. And again, thanks to you all for attending. And we will be back next year. So look out for the announcement. It's going to be a dynamic symposium next year. We don't know what it is just yet, but it will be just as dynamic as the past 2 years have been. So again, thank you all so much. And we will see you back here next year. Peace.